What if I told you that one of the most ruthless monopolies in global aviation isn't an airline from New York, London, or Tokyo, but a desert carrier that doesn't even belong in the markets it dominates? For decades, legacy airlines thought they had the skies safely locked down behind a wall of national borders, government treaties, and protective regulations. They thought they owned their local routes. They thought their monopolies were bulletproof. They were wrong. Emirates didn't just break the rules of international aviation, they weaponized a dusty, forgotten legal loophole buried deep inside a 1944 treaty to bypass every protectionist barrier in existence. It is called the fifth freedom of the air, and it is the most brilliant, cutthroat economic hack in corporate history. While legacy carriers bleed billions trying to protect their turf, Emirates uses this loophole to fly passengers between foreign countries where they have no business operating, undercutting local airlines, stealing millions of loyal customers, and rewriting the entire playbook of global trade. Traditional airlines are calling it legalized cheating. Global regulators are looking the other way. And right now, this single loophole is completely redrawing the map of how the world travels. And who makes the money doing it? Buckle up, because once you see how the fifth freedom actually works, you will never look at an airline ticket the same way again. Let's start with something you can go verify right now. Tonight, at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, an Airbus A380, the biggest passenger aircraft ever built, the one with the bar in the back and the showers in first class, is going to push back from the gate and fly to Milan. It is not operated by Delta. It is not operated by an Italian airline. It's Emirates. And you can walk up, buy a one-way ticket, New York to Milan, and never go anywhere near Dubai. Sit with that for a second. A Dubai-based airline is selling seats between two cities on the other side of the planet, on one of the most valuable premium routes in the entire transatlantic market. It has no domestic operation in Italy. It has no domestic operation in America. It employs a rounding error of people in either country compared to the giants it's competing against. And it has been doing this since October 2013. Now here's the part that really stings. Alitalia, Italy's flag carrier, propped up by its own government for decades, protected, subsidized, defended, no longer exists. It shut down in 2021. Its successor, ITA Airways, tried to fly Milan to New York too, and reportedly dropped the route because it couldn't make the numbers work. Emirates is still flying it. Daily. On an A380. So what actually happened here? How does an airline from a city of 3.5 million people end up owning premium capacity on a route between the world's fashion capital and the financial capital of the United States? The answer starts in a hotel ballroom in Chicago in the winter of 1944. World War II isn't over yet, but the Allies can see the finish line and there's a problem nobody has solved. The war has produced something nobody planned for. A planet suddenly covered in long-range aircraft, trained pilots, and paved runways. Aviation is about to explode. And there is no rulebook for who gets to fly where. Because here's the thing about airspace. Every country owns the sky above it. Absolutely and completely. You cannot fly a commercial aircraft over, into, or out of another nation without that nation's explicit permission. That principle is old, it's ironclad, and it's non-negotiable. So in November 1944, delegates from 54 nations show up in Chicago to figure out the post-war sky. And immediately, they split into two camps. The Americans want the sky wide open. Of course they do. The U.S. comes out of the war with the biggest aircraft industry on Earth and the most capable airlines. Open competition means American dominance. The British and most of Europe want the opposite. Their industries are bombed flat. Open skies for them means getting steamrolled. They want tight, regulated, controlled access. And they deadlock. What comes out of Chicago is the Chicago Convention, a genuinely historic document. It creates the framework for international civil aviation. It creates the organization that becomes ICAO. It's the constitution of the sky, and it still governs aviation today. But on the one question that actually mattered, Who is allowed to fly commercially where? They punt. The delegates draw up a set of categories called the freedoms of the air. 5 of them originally. There are 9 recognized today. They're not freedoms in any romantic sense. They're a menu, a technical vocabulary for describing traffic rights. And then they fail to agree on a treaty that grants them multilaterally. The document that would have handed out the first 5 freedoms to everyone gets signed by a handful of countries and effectively dies. The United States pulls out of it within 2 years. So the freedoms don't get distributed by one global agreement. Instead, they get negotiated country by country, pair by pair, deal by deal. Thousands of bilateral air service agreements, each one a private handshake between 2 governments. The delegates in Chicago thought they were building a fair, orderly system. What they actually built was a global patchwork with thousands of seams in it, and 70 years later, one airline would find the loosest seam and walk right through it. Let me make the freedoms simple, because most explanations make them sound harder than they are. First freedom is the right to fly over a country without landing, overflight. Second freedom is the right to land for fuel or maintenance, but not to pick up or drop off passengers, a technical stop. Third freedom is the right to carry passengers from your home country to another country. Emirates flying Dubai to Paris. Fourth freedom is the mirror image, carrying passengers from that other country back home. Paris to Dubai. 3 and 4 are the boring bread and butter of international aviation. Every airline has them, nobody argues about them. And then there's the 5th freedom, and this is where it gets interesting. The 5th freedom is the right to carry paying passengers between 2 foreign countries, as long as the flight starts or finishes in your home country. Read that again because the implications are enormous. Emirates flies Dubai to Milan. That's third freedom. Fine, normal, boring. But instead of turning that aircraft around and flying it home, Emirates keeps going. Milan to New York. And on that second leg, it is allowed to sell tickets to anyone. Italians going to America, Americans coming home, people who have never been to Dubai in their lives and never will. Emirates isn't a guest passing through Italian airspace. It's competing in the Italian market, head-to-head, on Italian soil, against Italian and American carriers, on a route that has nothing to do with the United Arab Emirates. That's the loophole. That's the whole thing, and once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere. Singapore Airlines sells seats Frankfurt to New York. Qantas flies Singapore to London. Emirates operates Athens to Newark, Barcelona to Mexico City, Miami to Bogota, Sydney to Christchurch, Bangkok to Hong Kong. There's a shadow network of routes threaded across the planet, flown by airlines that don't belong to either country on the ticket. But knowing the rule exists doesn't explain the outrage. Plenty of airlines have 5th freedom rights and never use them. The outrage is about the economics. And the economics are brutal. Here's the single most important thing to understand about running an airline. An aircraft sitting on the ground is a machine that loses money. A wide-body jet costs hundreds of millions of dollars. You're paying financing on it whether it flies or not. You're paying insurance. You're paying maintenance reserves. You're paying crews. Those costs do not care whether the plane is in the air or parked at a gate in Milan. So when Emirates flies Dubai to Milan, they have a choice. Turn around and go home, or keep going. If they turn around, that aircraft sits on the ground in Milan for hours, burning money, waiting for its return slot. If they keep going to New York, they generate an entirely new stream of ticket revenue and cargo revenue on an aircraft they were already paying for anyway. This is the part that makes the competition scream. The fixed costs are already sunk. The plane exists. The financing is already being paid. The crew base is already staffed. The route to Milan was already going to happen. So the Milan-New York leg only has to cover its marginal cost, the fuel, the airport fees, the crew hours for that specific sector. Meanwhile, when Delta flies New York to Milan, that route has to carry its full weight. Full aircraft ownership cost, full crew cost, full overhead allocation. The whole thing has to stand on its own. Now put those two airlines in a price war on the same route. One of them is defending a business that must be profitable by itself. The other is adding incremental revenue to an aircraft rotation that was already justified. You do not need an MBA to work out who can go lower. And that's before you get to the second layer. The fifth freedom lets you build routes that would otherwise be impossible. Dubai-Milan on its own might not fill an A380 every single day. Dubai-New York already has plenty of capacity. But chain them together, and suddenly, you've got an aircraft that's full on both legs, doing productive work almost around the clock, serving 3 markets with 1 rotation. Then there's cargo. That Milan flight isn't just carrying people, it's carrying Italian fashion, leather, machinery, cheese, tens of thousands of tons over the last decade, in the belly of an aircraft that was flying anyway. Pure margin. And finally, the strategic weapon, brand infiltration. Every time an Italian traveler flies Milan to New York on Emirates and experiences that A380, that service, that cabin, Emirates has just converted a customer inside a market it doesn't operate in. Next time that person books a trip to Asia or Africa or Australia, guess which airline they think of first? Fifth Freedom isn't just a route. It's a customer acquisition machine planted inside a competitor's home territory. So let's go back to Milan, because this is where the theory turned into a knife fight. October 2013. Emirates launches Dubai, Milan, New York, initially on a Boeing 777, later upgraded to the A380. The route was not empty. Alitalia was there. American was there. Delta was there. United was flying to Newark. This was a mature, contested, valuable market, and Emirates walked in and started selling. Alitalia went to war. It challenged the flight in the Italian courts. It got backing from its alliance partners, who had every reason to want Emirates out. This wasn't a quiet grumble in a trade magazine. This was formal, legal warfare to strip a competitor of its right to fly. And in December 2014, the Italian courts ruled in favor of Emirates. But here's the detail that completely reframes this story, and it's the one you almost never hear. According to Emirates President Tim Clark, the Italian government approached Emirates and asked them to operate out of Malpensa. Read that again. The Italian state, the same state that had spent years protecting Alitalia, looked at Milan Malpensa, saw an underserved airport and limited long-haul competition, and invited the Gulf carrier in. Because governments and flag carriers don't want the same things. Alitalia wanted protection, but the Italian government wanted a functioning airport in its economic capital. It wanted tourists, it wanted cargo capacity for its export industries, it wanted its citizens to have direct flights and lower fares. And a foreign airline willing to provide all of that for free, no subsidy required from Rome, was, from the government's perspective, a gift. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire conversation. Fifth freedom rights aren't something regulators are asleep at the wheel about. They're granted, deliberately, in signed bilateral agreements, because the country granting them usually benefits, even when its own airline is screaming. The scoreboard a decade on. Over 1.8 million passengers carried on that route, around 6,000 flights, tens of thousands of tons of cargo. Alitalia is gone. ITA has reportedly walked away from the route. Emirates is still there, still daily, still on the A380. By 2015, the American majors had had enough. Delta, American, and United formed a lobbying coalition, the Partnership for Open and Fair Skies, pulled in the pilot and flight attendant unions, and went to Washington with a very specific number: $42 billion. That's what they claimed Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways had received in state subsidies and unfair benefits over roughly a decade. Their argument was blunt. These aren't real airlines competing on merit. They're instruments of state policy, and every route they take is American jobs destroyed. The Gulf carriers hit back hard. Emirates filed a lengthy rebuttal, arguing it publishes audited financials to international standards, that it's been profitable for the vast majority of its existence, and that the American majors had all recently come through bankruptcy restructuring, which is its own form of state-enabled relief. They also pointed at something awkward. The same U.S. carriers complaining about state-owned airlines were sitting in global alliances alongside dozens of state-owned or state-invested carriers, and had invested directly in some of them. 3 years of lobbying, congressional pressure, governors and mayors writing letters, a full-blown political campaign, and in May 2018, the United States and the UAE signed a record of discussion. Here's what the U.S. airlines got. The UAE agreed to transparency commitments around published financial statements and arm's-length dealings. Here's what they didn't get. The agreement explicitly reaffirmed the existing Open Skies deal, Fifth Freedom rights fully intact. The UAE separately indicated its carriers had no current plans to change their Fifth Freedom services, but that's a statement of intent, not a binding restriction. The UAE's position throughout was that it had always been in full compliance. Industry analysts read the outcome bluntly. After a 3-year campaign, the U.S. majors had achieved very little. And then there's the detail that quietly demolishes the moral high ground. The single largest operator of Fifth Freedom services between the U.S. and the UAE isn't Emirates. It's FedEx, an American company, running a hub in Dubai. The loophole cuts both ways. It always did. Now let me complicate the story, because if you stop here, you've misunderstood Emirates completely. Tim Clark has said publicly that Fifth Freedom flights are not a main facet of the Emirates business model. And he's right, because the actual weapon is the Sixth Freedom. Sixth Freedom is carrying passengers between 2 foreign countries via your own hub. Manchester to Bangkok, connecting in Dubai. Johannesburg to Tokyo, connecting in Dubai. Neither passenger is going to the UAE. Both are transiting. That is the entire Emirates business model. Dubai sits within roughly 8 hours of most of the world's population. Emirates built a fleet of long-range wide-bodies and turned a desert city into the connecting point for the planet. Every Sixth Freedom passenger is a passenger who could have connected through London on British Airways, or Frankfurt on Lufthansa, or Paris on Air France. That's where the real damage was done. Not a dozen Fifth Freedom routes. A systematic, industrial-scale rerouting of global connecting traffic away from European hubs. So why does the Fifth Freedom matter so much? Because it's the visible version. It's the one people can see. When Emirates takes a connecting passenger away from Lufthansa, it's invisible. It happens in a booking engine. When Emirates parks an A380 at Milan Malpensa and sells tickets to New York, the local flag carrier has to physically watch it happen from the next gate over. Fifth Freedom is where an abstract economic war becomes personal. So let's come back to where we started. Emirates has built a shadow network across the planet. Milan to New York, Athens to Newark, Barcelona to Mexico City, Miami to Bogota, Sydney to Christchurch, Bangkok to Hong Kong. Routes that don't touch Dubai. A parallel airline hiding inside an airline, assembled entirely out of other countries' airspace. It did it without breaking a single rule. Every one of those routes was granted by a government that signed a piece of paper because it decided its citizens, its airports, and its exporters would be better off with a foreign airline in the market than without one. So here's where I have to hand it to you, because I genuinely can't settle this one. If you think the Fifth Freedom is legalized cheating, you've got a real case. State-backed capital, competing against airlines that answer to shareholders on routes where the economics were never symmetrical. That's not a level playing field, and pretending otherwise is naive. But if you think this is just competition finally arriving in an industry that spent 70 years hiding behind flag carriers and national pride, you've got a case too. Fares came down. Cities got connected, passengers got better aircraft, and the airlines that lost mostly lost because they'd been protected for so long, they'd forgotten how to fight. Alitalia had 8 decades and a government behind it. Emirates started in 1985 with 2 leased aircraft and $10 million. One of them is still flying. So, brilliant capitalism or a state-funded weapon wearing an airline's uniform? Tell me in the comments. And if you want the next piece of this puzzle, how Dubai turned a patch of desert into the connecting point for the entire planet, that video's next.